In this video, we're going to give a high-level look at the classes that we'll be putting together as a part of this first iteration of our third-person character system. Now, that said, we need to kind of talk about, at least briefly, about this iterative process.
Right, we're actually going to be doing this in several stages. We're going to go in stages of complexity, starting with very basic, and then adding features all the way up to the point that we get to our final product, which will be the fully animated bipedal character.
So right now we've got simple, then we're going to have a more enhanced version, and then we're going to have the one that will actually support a biped.
Correct.
Now currently, you are here. This is you, and you're learning at this stage. Now, what are we responsible for here? All we want is what exactly?
When we're done with this set of videos for the simple character, we're going to have a character that can move around laterally in our scene. And then it's going to have a camera that you can orbit around the character. Now, the camera is not going to have any collision detection or occlusion detection on it. This is just going to be simply one that we can rotate around the camera. If you have played with the third-person camera system that comes with Unity, that camera is going to be similar to that. So it will not respect any geometry in your scene. This, unlike the one that's inside of the Unity scene, allows you to freely orbit the camera. Which is kind of why we're doing this to begin with. Is we're trying to come up with a different way that you can make a third-person camera, and we're going to show you step by step what you can do with it.
And here in this first version, we're just going to deal with moving the character around and orbiting the camera around the character while we play. Now, I'm not going to talk in this video about the functionality of these other two iterations. We're going to keep all of our focus here on our simple version. So, that understood, let's just begin from square one with the classes that we'll be putting together in this first iteration. Now, how many classes are we going to have?
Well, there are 3 major classes that make up the system, and we have a 4th that we use just to give us some helper methods to support the other 3 classes.
Well, let's just start off by looking at these first 3 initial classes. What's the first one we're going to be taking a look at?
The very first one is TP Controller, and TP being third person.
So yeah, we'll be saying TP a lot, and in this case, it's an abbreviation for third person.
Yes, it just saves a lot of writing and typing. So the TP controller is kind of the brains or the central nervous system of our entire character. His job is to take player input and determine what to do with it.
So it's processing player inputs.
Yes. In this simple example, all of his concentration is going to be taking in motion input and converting it into a move vector. What that means is when a player uses the WASD keys or the up, down, left, right keys, or possibly a joystick or gamepad input, it's looking for that input, and it's going to convert it into a vector 3 or a 3-dimensional vector that's going to represent our motion. He also has another function. When the game first starts running, he's going to send a signal to one of our other classes to ensure that our camera is set up and ready to go.
So let's say, I guess you'd call this just like a quick initial setup?
Yes.
Or initial setup check, I suppose. Because really, if he's just looking for something, he's not really doing anything other than just saying, hey.
Yeah, he's going, hey, I'm getting ready to run. Is our camera ready to go? So he makes sure that the camera is ready to go. And similar to that, he's also going to make sure that the camera is always there.
All right. So, like, throughout the entire gameplay process, he's going to keep verifying, hey, is the camera still there?
Yeah, just to make sure that nothing bad happens to the camera. So if the camera goes away, he's going to stop working. But he's going to do it in a way that doesn't cause all kinds of errors.
So again, kind of like a brain, an overseer, if you will. Take in everything the player is telling our character to do. It'll translate that into a vector. Now, the vector itself, it's not going to do anything fancy with. We're going to be processing that vector in our next class, which is called
TP Motor.
TP Motor.
Now, TP Motor's job is to take the motion data that it receives from the controller and process it. This is where we're going to take that move vector. We're going to do all the mathematics that we need to do to convert it from a local or character space into world space motion. We're going to have to do some normalizing. We're going to have to multiply it by a move speed. And then we're going to have to adjust that so that motion is based on seconds and not frames.
Instead of computer cycles.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And those are all, yeah, that's like a lot of little specific stuff we'll get into when we actually get to coding the TP motor. We'll go over exactly how all of that's going to be working.
Right.
Right now, it's just important for you to know that the job of TP motor is going to be to take in this motion data from our TP controller and process that into lateral motion. Is our character moving left, and moving right, and moving forward, backward, or any of the diagonal directions found within there? In doing that, we got to do some fancy things.
Right.
We've got to normalize that information that comes in so that the character isn't moving. For instance, you can potentially move at full speed forward and full speed to the left, and that will cause you to actually move faster when you're going in diagonal directions. We'll be looking at how to solve that problem.
Right. That's something that is throwback to the real old games. You could kind of take your joystick and move it to the sideways direction. You could always run faster than you could forward or to the side.
Yeah, I remember seeing that kind of stuff like on the old Nintendo games way back in the day.
Right. Now this TP motor has an additional function, and that is to maintain the character's orientation or rotation relative to our camera. In the scheme that we're going with for this third-person camera, all motion is going to be relative to the direction that the camera is facing, which means if we move forward, the character is always going to be running away from the camera.
Okay.
If we hit backwards, the character is going to step backwards towards the direction of the camera, and left and right will be relative to that as well.
So this means you're not going to have any sort of direct inputs from the player to control your character's rotation, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not like we're going to have a turn left or turn right input.
No, what we could do, though, is we can turn our camera by orbiting it around, and while pushing the forward direction, we, in effect, will be steering our camera, or
steering
our
the
character with our camera.
Yeah. It's kind of like the I'm looking this way, so go this way mentality.
Right. Similar if anybody's played WoW, it's kind of
World
like
of Warcraft when he says WoW, by the way.
Sorry, yep.
It's, I mean, generally it's pretty safe to say, you know, if we say WoW, we mean World of Warcraft, but...
Well, only for about 12 million people.
Right, exactly. But if you're outside that fairly small circle of 12 million players who are familiar with that, he's referring to the camera system available in World of Warcraft, which has become popular in several MMOs, and there are actually a lot of 3D platformer games that use styles like this, especially on consoles such as the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, where you'll have one of your control sticks just controls the lateral motion of the character, while the right control stick controls the either the camera's orientation by just spinning it around while the character sits still, or in some cases that controls the rotation of the character and the camera follows. This is just the mentality we chose to use, where we're going to be using that secondary input to pivot the camera around and then use the direction of the camera to say, all right, camera's looking this way, now when we hit forward, the character's going to turn this way and go.
Right. And this system is flexible enough that once you've built it, if you decide that you want to change the base functionality of how it moves, you can take this base framework and modify it in such a way to work the way you choose it, or you choose.
That's right. I'm just going to jot that down as a note. So the camera's look direction defines the character's orientation when they're moving.
Which means that if you stop moving, you can move the camera, and the character will still stay facing the direction that they were.
Right. Exactly. And apparently, I'm having really hardcore problems writing today. So those are the basics of our TP motor. At this stage of the game, it's really just going to be handling the lateral motion and the fact that we need to rotate the rotate the character based on what the camera's looking at. Which brings us to our next class,
which is our TP camera.
TP camera.
And as you would imagine, this is the class that controls our camera.
Right, so we've got our brain, our TP controller, and of course the TP controller is... Now I'm just going to get a little bit fancy here just to remind people what everything's doing. Our TP controller is responsible for taking in input, so this is my game controller. And we have TP motor, whose job is to move the character around. Now, of course, in this set, as of right now, we don't have a bipedal character. But since we're just considering all character motion to be about the same, this is what is going to drive our character around and make them move. Now we get over to TP camera, which is going to control what it is we're looking at. Now, of course, I'm going to draw kind of a camera icon for TP camera because it makes sense. But really, there'd be a lot more to it than just the camera itself. It'd be all of the boom equipment and the carts and everything you needed to move the camera into the proper position.
Yeah, the dolly tracks and
exactly.
everything.
And that's the whole idea here. It's moving the camera around and getting it positioned appropriately. So let's talk about the TP camera class.
Right. This primary functionality is to take the mouse input or the inputs coming from the mouse and convert them into orbital information for the camera.
So this class is going to take its own set of inputs.
Yes.
Let's jot that down separately. Now, why are we not taking in inputs from TP controller?
Well, by allowing the TP camera class to deal with its own input in its own way, we've now separated it from the TP controller. So if I want, I could actually take this script, attach it to a camera, and I could allow that camera to exist without the character in space.
All right, the two are not... Well, the TP controller is dependent on the camera, but not the other way around.
Right. So, in essence, if I really wanted to, I could take this system, I could attach it to an object that was animated through our scene, and I could technically use this as a fly-through camera.
Without having to worry about dropping in the TP controller and whatnot.
Right.
Okay, and that's why that's been broken up. Now, earlier on, before we continue on with anything else TP camera is doing, we did mention that one of the tasks of TP controller was to do an initial setup check to look for the camera.
Right. If you've played with Unity previously, you know when you create a new scene, it creates a main camera for you.
Right.
Now, what this initial check does is it looks to see if that camera still exists.
Okay.
If it still exists, it's going to take control of it. It's going to attach this script to that camera and tie it into your system. But if for some reason it doesn't find that main camera, it will then go ahead, create a new camera, and turn it into a main camera.
Well, it's going to tell the TP camera class to make a new camera, yeah?
Yes. Well, the TP camera class has that function built in.
Right. I just want to make sure that people were clear that TP controller is not going to create that camera. TP controller is going to tell TP camera to make that camera.
Yes.
Right. So let's get back over here to our functionality.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Yeah. I'm just making sure we know what signals are being sent out by whom and what's going on. So we'll be doing a little bit of jumping back and forth, but don't worry, we're going to review everything by the time we're done.
Right.
So TP camera is going to take its own inputs from the mouse, and it's going to use these inputs to orbit the camera. Am I right so far?
So basically, it's going to take the mouse X and Y positional changes, and it's going to use that to control the rotation about the character.
Okay.
And it's going to use the mouse wheel to control how far the camera is from the character.
So kind of dolly the camera in and out, or okay, we'll just say zoom the camera in and out, even though technically it's not a zoom, but
because we're not changing field of view.
We won't get into all that though. So you can push the camera in toward and away from the player with the mouse wheel. You can rotate the camera around by moving the mouse. Now, in our case, we'll be changing that up just the tiniest little bit in that we won't be pivoting the camera unless we're holding the right mouse button?
Yes.
Okay. And that's just a preference on our end. If you wanted to, you could take out that functionality so that anytime you're moving the mouse, you are rotating the camera.
Right. The reason we chose this scheme isn't so much that we like it as a gameplay mechanic. We chose this scheme because if we didn't and we started moving the mouse while we were doing these videos, our camera would be spinning wildly as we're trying to get to the pause or show things on the Unity editor's engine.
Right. And if there were, if you're playing or designing the kind of game where the player needed to needed to have mouse interactivity with various on-screen elements, say aspects of a HUD that had to be clicked on throughout gameplay, or any similar feature. Maybe some buttons you need to click to make the character do this, that, or the other while you're playing. Then it would be smarter to set up a similar system where if you want to move the camera, you've got a modifier key. If you just want to use the mouse like a mouse pointer, then that's just already inherent to the nature of the thing. So we'll be using our inputs to orbit the camera. Now, what else can this guy do? This guy has the power, this class, TP camera, has the power to create a brand new camera if it needs one.
Right, that's kind of where I went off in my little sidetrack when I didn't realize you were talking about TP controller again.
Right, and we'll come back. The only reason I wanted to mention TP controller again is that we did already say that there was going to be an initial setup check. So we do have some sort of a signal coming out of TP controller at the beginning, and there's actually another check that'll be bouncing out throughout the entire gameplay process. We'll get to that here in just a moment. So first off, this TP camera class has the power to create its own camera if one doesn't exist.
Right. So it will either take control of the main camera if it finds one, or create its own if it doesn't.
I think that's a better way to write it. So it's going to take control of main camera. Or it'll create one if one doesn't exist.
And this is just kind of a fail-safe, so you don't ever want to have two main cameras in the scene. You'll get some really weird playback anomalies if that happens. So this will take control of it, but if for some reason one doesn't exist, it will create it so you at least always have a main camera in your scene.
Right. Okay, and that's kind of where we get into this initial check that TP controller is performing right as we start the game. TP controller is going to say, hey, does a main camera exist? And if one does, then it's going to fire off this functionality of TP camera and say, all right, great, there is a camera. Let's go ahead and take control of that so that we can use it during the game. If there's not one, TP controller can say, all right, well, there wasn't one. It's the same part of functionality. TP camera will say, okay, one didn't exist. Now let's make a brand new camera, and we'll take control of that one. Now, during gameplay, TP controller is constantly going to be double-checking to make sure the camera still exists. And it's not necessarily so that we could, instantly create a new main camera during gameplay if it happened to disappear. It's just as a way to make sure that the camera is still there because we're dependent on it for our motion.
Right, and because of the way Unity is set up, if you're playing in the editor, you do have the ability to actually go and delete the main camera, or you could do it from code, and if for some reason the main camera suddenly disappears, this will cease the functionality of the character controller setup that we're creating.
Yeah, so we'll just say if... And I realize I'm running out of room, so I'm trying to be really careful with how I word stuff. But if camera is gone, we just simply stop working.
And this is to prevent errors from being thrown up that could cause Unity to crash or start causing unpredictable results.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the TP camera, the whole time it's doing its thing, it is, of course, having to send some rotational information that is being processed by TP motor. And I realize I don't have a lot of room here, so I'm just going to kind of cut across.
Right. What's happening here is every time the motor detects that it's actually in motion, it's going to look at the camera's rotation about the y-axis so it can match the character to that rotation.
Which gets us back to this, and this is what this is all about really, is making sure that the character's rotation is dependent upon that camera's rotation.
Right.
So character's rotation is dependent. Make sure I said that right. Character's rotation is dependent on camera rotation.
Right.
Now, that is all three of our primary classes, and it also breaks down how they relate to one another. TP controller is where everything kind of begins. That's going to take in inputs from the user. Did they apply a certain amount of pressure to an axis on a joystick? Are they pressing some buttons for any lateral motion? And it's going to convert that into a move vector, a directional vector, which the TP motor is going to then process. Now, other kind of additional functionality of TP controller is to start off at the very beginning by saying, hey, do we have a camera? TP camera, do your thing for that. Just make sure we have one and respond accordingly. And it's also going to, throughout the game, just say, hey, we still do have a camera, right? Because, we need one to move the character around. So that's kind of everything that TP Controller is going to be doing at this stage. Now, at the same time, we have TP Motor. He's going to grab that move vector that was calculated within TP Controller, and he's going to make it make sense for moving the character. He's going to process it. He'll normalize the extent of that vector so that we don't get any odd motions when moving at diagonals. It'll make sure that that vector is converted from something developed from straight axial input and converts that to a world space motion vector so that we can move the character in the proper direction instead of just only along, say, the X and Z axes, for example. Now, at the same time, the TP motor is going to constantly be checking the rotation of the camera and saying, hey, are we moving right now? Because if we're moving, we need to be rotating the character such that he's always moving away from the camera. So rotate the character to aim in the same direction that the camera's looking. And it'll be checking that the whole time we're in motion. Right now, that's the main purpose of TP motor. You agree?
Yes.
All right. Then we get over here to TP camera, and it's going to take its own inputs completely separate from TP controller. And again, the big reason we did that is to break apart that primary functionality so that if we were in a situation where we just needed a camera and the ability to move a camera, we're not dependent on there being a character in the scene. We've broken out the two separate functionalities out. Our TP controller, you could argue, is really more about about dealing with inputs pertaining to moving the player than anything else, where TP camera brings in its own inputs specifically for handling camera's position and orientation. Now, we're going to be using our inputs to orbit the camera. We're not going to have, move camera to the left, move camera to the right, and technically that's exactly what we're doing, but the perceived motion in terms of the player is going to be an orbital type motion where we're always looking at a specific point relative to the character.
And we're always going to be rotating about that pivot point and always looking at that point.
And we will be moving the camera to make this happen. It's not all handled through rotation, but the perceived effect as far as the player's concerned is that we're just orbiting and always looking at a specific point. And then as a secondary kind of additional function, the camera is going to be called upon by TP controller at the beginning of the game to either take control of the main camera or create a new camera based on whether or not we have one in the scene.
Right.
Now, that's not all, really. Those are the three main classes, and that's a good breakdown of everything they're supposed to be doing for us. But there's actually another little guy over here, and I'm going to put him in a circle instead of a square. And this is our helper class.
Yep. What I like to do when I build my projects is I build a static class that I name helper. Mm-hmm. Now, he's kind of like my little go-to toolbox. I like to set him off in the corner of my workshop, and if for some reason I've got some functionality that I can't really assign to any of the other classes, and he doesn't really have a home yet, I'll throw these methods into this helper class, and I'll make them static, and that way I can use them in all my other classes if I need them.
Gotcha.
In this case, for this first simple project, there's one method that I'm going to need that I call clamp angle. Now, the whole functionality of this particular method is I'm going to pass it an angle, and I'm going to pass it a minimum and a maximum angle. And what this method is going to do is it's going to ensure that the angle comes back somewhere between the range of negative 360 and positive 360, but it will be clamped based on the angles that I feed into it.
Okay. So at the moment, this helper class's only job is to take in an angle and basically clamp it out and feed back the result to you. Mm-hmm. Now, anybody could potentially call on this helper class. That's the whole idea. Now, how are we going to be using it exactly?
We're going to use it in TP camera to restrict the Y rotation of the rotation about the x-axis or our y angle.
The vertical rotation of the camera.
Right. What we want to do is make sure that we can't rotate our camera up and directly above our character and then back down the other side.
Thereby flipping the camera upside down and putting the ceiling up above us or the floor up above like a ceiling. Yeah, that'd be really confusing.
Right. And I also want to limit the amount of angle that we can move the camera below our character.
Okay.
Now, in a flat world where there's just a ground plane, that's not so much of a deal. But with our character, where we can actually climb up on top of boxes, this will enable us to take our camera, move it below our character, be able to look up at the character.
Well, and I've seen similar setups when you have an orbital style camera in third-person games, and I can't think of one where I've ever been able to rotate all the way around the character. And even if you could, I can't imagine that being particularly useful, because the effect on the screen is now that the character's upside down and staring at you.
Right, and you can really mess up the rotations and get yourself into a condition called gimbal lock. So this just prevents us from getting ourselves in that type of situation.
And again, right now, only TP Camera is going to be utilizing it. In further iterations of the third-person character system, we'll be adding some more functionality into the helper class that can reach out in other directions, basically. Right now, it's going to be a simple workshop that really only performs one job.
Right.
So that's it. That is everything that we're about to be creating for this first stage of our third-person character system. Again, and I mean, I'm not going to... I think I've already reviewed it like twice. We're going to go from TP controller to TP motor, then to TP camera, make sure our helper function is in place, and we'll be done. So in the next video, we're going to be focusing on what exactly is going to go into the construction of our TP controller. And unless you have anything to add, Lee...
Well, that's it for this video.
All right, then yeah, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at the theory for our TP controller. Thanks.